Alright, so welcome to episode 1 of video game development using Blender and Unity. In this episode we're going to start with the basics of downloading Blender, character modeling, and actually starting to get a feel for the program. So the program that we're working with, once again, is this program here called Blender. You can download it at the website, I'll put it in the description, blender.org. And just download Blender. Right now the current full version is 2.7, or if you have Steam like me, you can launch into Steam and get it via Steam, and that way it will auto-update as it goes on. So once we launch into Blender here, there's a few different things that we're going to want to get started with right off the bat. First off being, what do you do when you start? So this is just what you're going to be working with in Blender. You can just click past this window here, and this is your first open window. What are we going to cover? We're going to cover how to move in Blender, how to 3D model, and some different tips and tricks that I can help you out with. So I've got this document here. I'll put the URL to in the description. It is all the different tips I have for getting started with Blender. So we'll just go through this list one by one, and I'll show you how to do things. Just as a side note, I've got this little screencasting keys enabled here, so you can see whatever I do, you can follow as well. So for example, we want to learn how to move the camera here. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is, if you're using a mouse, just press the middle mouse button, and you can just move your mouse around, and you'll rotate around the center point of your world. If you don't have a mouse, just use your trackpad. The same thing can be done by using 2 fingers, just scrolling around, and then you should be able to just move your camera. Also, in conjunction with holding shift and doing that same movement, you pan around while you're looking at the same thing. So this is just with 2 fingers here, and this is with the middle mouse button. As well, if you hold control and use the scroll wheel, you'll slide right to left, and if you just use 2 fingers, you'll zoom in or out just by holding control here. That's 2 fingers on the trackpad, and if you just scroll with the mouse wheel, then you'll zoom in or out. So by using those 3 things, you should just be able to zoom or scroll or pan, and that should be able to move you around the world. For the most part. A lot of people, however, like to press Shift and F at the same time. That brings them into what I like to call first-person mode, and so you can use W, A, S, and D to move around like you're flying, like a first-person camera. And if you press Shift while you press W, A, S, or D, you speed up the process in which you're moving. Then wherever you want to look at your object, you just click, and that's where you are now. And then you can continue to move around like this. Also, you have this little view button here, and if you click on this, the first thing is whatever your active camera is, and in this case we're not even using cameras, so that doesn't matter. But if you click left, right, back, forward, it will snap your camera angle to straight those angles. So if I click left here, it's going to snap my angle to directly left. Or if I click view back, it's going to snap it directly to the back, view top, front, so on. It will just do that snapping movement for you. Additionally, on top of that, you can change your camera from perspective to orthographic mode. Perspective is basically where you can see all of your sides as if you're looking through a real camera, where orthographic would be as if you're viewing through a 2D camera. So if I switch my camera, it might look a little funky here, but you can see everything becomes completely flat and even. It would be a much better tool if you wanted to do something like view your front and then edit your object. That way you can always see all 4 sides perfectly flat and even, whereas if you're in perspective mode, it might not necessarily be like that, because the back further away, it would get smaller as it gets further away. Yeah, so now let's just move on to some controls and tips for actually starting to get started with 3D modeling. First, when you're selecting and unselecting objects, the main thing that you're going to want to do is just right-click on the object that you're trying to select, and it will get this little orange highlight around it. On top of that, if you hold Shift while you right-click, it will select 2 objects at a time, or even 3 objects at a time. If you press A, it will unselect everything that's selected, and if you have nothing selected and you press A, it will select everything in the world. So I have nothing selected here, press A once, it will select everything, press A again, it will unselect everything. So for example, if I have 1 object selected, but I want everything to be selected, I would just tap A twice, and everything would be selected. Next, what we can do is press the X key to bring up our delete menu. So for example, say I want to delete this light, I'm going to select it by right-clicking on it, then I'm going to press X, and it will bring up this menu. Would you like to delete it? And then just click yes, and it will delete the object. If I want to delete everything in the world, I just press A so that it selects everything, then press X, and then press delete. Now that there's nothing in the world, let's start with a basic mesh. So we're going to press the Shift key, and then while holding the Shift key, we're going to press the A key, and it'll bring up this menu. And this menu is all the different things that we can spawn into our world. So we want to spawn a mesh, and let's just start by spawning a cube, just like how we had it. So now that we have a cube in our object, we can start 3D modeling it. The first thing that we're going to want to do to edit a mesh object is we're going to have to go into edit mode. So right here you can see we're in object mode, and we can just simply click edit mode, or you can use the hotkey just by pressing tab to switch in and out of edit mode. When we're in edit mode, the same thing happens that we're in non-edit mode, where we can just right click a specific point and it will just highlight that, and if we press shift we can right click those points and it will highlight all of the ones while we're holding shift. If we press A, we'll unselect everything, A again, it will select everything. But right now we're highlighting what's called the vertices on our cube, where if you see down here there's 3 different buttons: vertices, edges, and faces. So if I click edges right here, it's going to select edges now instead of the corners, and if I click faces now, it's going to select all the different faces. So if we want to hold shift, there you go, you can see we're selecting different things, pan around, we're selecting different edges, and there now we have all, unselect just by pressing A, simple stuff. So once we have something selected, like a face or an edge or a corner, you can see it comes up with this little GUI here with these arrows. So this is the x-axis, right here, the y-axis, and the z-axis. And what you can do is you can simply just click on one of those axes and move them, and you'll edit the mesh. So you see, I just clicked on this little green arrow, and it's moving this face on this y-axis just by dragging it here. Of course, you can just press Command or Control-Z to undo that movement. And if you are moving an object, there's different ways to move it. So right now we're grabbing this by the little red arrow and moving it. Also what we can do is we can just press the G key, and that's grabbing it, and it will attach it to our mouse. So wherever we move our mouse, it will move with us, and if we just click, it will stay there. If we accidentally move it and we don't want to, you just right click and it will go back to the position where it was before we started moving it. Now that we've talked about G, which is grabbing an object and moving it, there are 2 other main things that I would say we would want to use commonly, and those are the E key and the R key. So if we have a face selected here and we press E, what it's going to do is it's going to extrude that face. So it's basically going to duplicate that face while keeping it attached to the object. And then on top of extruding, we can extrude any face however much we want. There's 2 other things that we can do to modify this face. So the first one is S for scale. So if we just press S here, you can see it's going to scale to the size of our wherever we move our mouse, and if we press R, it's going to rotate. So once we have a face or vertice or edge selected, we can change them depending on S, R, and E, as well as moving them using G. And all of these things are impacted by the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. So for example, if I just take this face here and I extrude it upwards, we can scale it like this, and it's just going to scale on its position. But if we just want to scale it on just the x-axis, we can just press X, and it's just going to scale it on the x but leave the y exactly the same. Similarly, we can press the Y key, and it will just scale it on the y-axis. And of course, if we're scaling it on the z-axis, which is this blue one, we can press S and Z, and it's actually going to do nothing because this is just a face that we're selecting, and you can't actually change the size of a face because it's perfectly flat already, right? But if we were to take this whole object just by going into object mode by pressing tab here, and then we were to press S, you can scale the whole object, and then you can scale it on the z-axis just by pressing S and then pressing Z, and you can see it just growing on the z-axis or shrinking, and of course we can just click where we want it, and the same can be done for the x-axis like so, or the y-axis, and just right click to set it back to how it was. In a similar fashion, the R key is used for rotate, so if I have the object selected and I just press R to rotate it, you can see it's just going to follow my mouse around willy-nilly, depending on how I'm looking at it. But if we press the R key, like I have, and then press the X key, it's going to just rotate it on the X-axis, similarly the Y-axis, just by pressing Y, and the Z-axis. And that's just going to rotate this object around the axis that I have selected. So if we go into tab mode, or edit mode, just by pressing tab here, and then scale this face down a little bit just by pressing S and then click where we want it, we can then rotate it on just the Z-axis, maybe extrude it a little bit, scale it down a little bit just by pressing S, maybe rotate it on the z-axis a little bit more, and then maybe scale it down a little bit more, extrude, scale, rotate on the z-axis, and you can see, just by going back into object mode here, you can get some quite fun shapes going on. Now that we have the basics of modeling down here, we can just delete this object by pressing X, delete, when it's highlighted, and spawn in a new object by pressing Shift A, and then adding a cube. So here are some other things that might help you with modeling, just some basic tips and tricks. If we're on an object and it's selected and we go into edit mode, you can press the W key to pull up your specials menu. For example, you might want to subdivide. And if you click here, it's going to pull up the subdivide menu, and you can change. You can see it brings up all the different cuts, 1 time or 2 times, 3 times, so on. Specials. Also, if we're on an object like so, we can press the Z key and it will bring us to wireframe mode, and this makes the object or mesh or everything that's in the world completely see-through, so that we can select a vertex that's on the opposite side from where we are. That just allows you to see through objects. The B key is used to bring up your selection tool. So if we just press B here and we click in this corner and we drag, it's going to select everything that we can see on the screen. But you see, it only selected what we could see. So if we press A to unselect and press Z, then you can use the B key and select all the vertices on the screen, press Z again, and you can see that everything is selected. Or alternatively, you could just press A and it will unselect everything, and then if you press it again, it will select everything. When you're rotating an object, for example, I have this whole object here, I'm going to go to faces, I press R and it's going to rotate it around where my mouse is and how I'm looking at it. But if you press R again a second time, it's going to pull up a different form of rotating, which is almost completely random in comparison to the direction that it rotates, and it's not dependent on how you're looking at it, it's just dependent on how you move your mouse. You can activate and disactivate your menus on the sides by pressing T, this will bring up this menu, and by pressing N, this will bring up this menu here, and these allow certain specific tools. For example, I have this plugin for shortcuts here, and that is controlled completely by my end screen here, just by this little menu here. And I can disable that just by hovering over here, pressing N or pressing T, and that will pull up this menu as well. If I delete this object, you can see I can press Shift A to spawn in new objects. Similarly, I can press Shift S to snap objects or my cursor to specific locations. So my cursor is this little object in the middle here. You can see if I click around, it's going to move wherever I click. And then when I spawn a mesh by pressing Shift A, it's going to spawn in the place where I have clicked. For example, right? But say I want to spawn my mesh in the exact center of my world. Well, I can put my cursor back to the center by pressing Shift S and then bringing my mouse all the way down to this little one right here that says cursor to center, and it will snap my cursor back to the center. If I were to have a mesh at the wrong spot and my cursor at the wrong spot, I could press Shift S, cursor to center, and then Shift S selected to cursor. So my object is selected over here, and then it will just put it to the cursor, which we have just set in the center. You can also use Shift plus D to duplicate an object, and if you're in tab mode and you have a specific section selected, Shift plus D will duplicate that selected section. In edit mode, you can use the K key to bring up what's called cut. So if we just press K, it's going to bring up this little knife icon here, and we can click right here on the edge and it will pull up this purple line, and we can click somewhere else. Maybe we want to cut to this corner and then click, and when we are satisfied with our cut, we just press enter and it's going to put in a cut in our object. So now we can take this and just select that specific area and move it how we want. Command or Control can be used for Command C, Command V, or Command D, as well as Control C, Control V, and Control D for the usual things. So I might want to copy this. I'm on a Mac, I'll hit Command C, and then I want to duplicate it, I'll just press Command V, and then there it pasted another one on top of it. In the same way, you could just hit Shift D. And of course, Command or Control Z will undo previous actions that you have already done. Another tip that you might want to know is when you're editing, if you press Tab, you can press Control and R at the same time to bring up what's called it's like a cut line. And so if you hover over your object, it will, and move your mouse around, it may bring up this purple line, and you can find the cut that you want. And if you just click, it will put a cut in your object where that is. And if you click again, it will put it wherever you have clicked. So there you can see it. Now I have a line put in my object, and then I can just continue editing from there. When you're editing an object in tab mode, sometimes you may be working with very precise vertices. And so if you were to right click on a face and delete it just by clicking X, you can delete just the face, but that just leaves a hole in your object. And if you have a hole in your object like this, it actually creates a lot of problems later on. And so what you want to do is you can fill in a space just by selecting a couple of vertices here and pressing F, and that will fill that space back in. You can make one object the parent of another object. So if I take this object and duplicate it and move it over here, and I want this to be like the mom or the dad of this object, what we're going to do is we're going to select what's called the child object first by right-clicking on this one, and then we're going to press Shift and right-click on this one, and then if we just press Control and P, we can set the parent to this object. And if we just click that, you can see we get this little dotted black line in between them. So what we can do now is if we take this object and move it, you can see it moves freely on its own. But if we take this object and move it, it will move its child object with it. And so that can lead to some really interesting stuff later on, and we'll talk about that when we get to rigging. Don't forget to save your work. You can do that just by pressing Command S or Control S, and it will ask you if you would like to save over if you already have a save file, but initially you may just need to press File and then Save or Save As, and then you can save it in a specific location on your computer. So I am saving this Blender file, just call it Blender, and if it's red, that means you're writing over a previous file. So if you have a new Blender file, make sure to rewrite it as a new name, but I'm okay with saving this on top. And then from there on out, if you add and work, you can just press Command or Control S and then click, and it will save, of course. So now some basic UI tips of how you can help edit your mesh. So first of all, if we have a mesh, there may be some different things that you want to add to it that you may not be able to do so easily through just regular editing. For example, maybe I want to put a hole in my object, and I don't want to go through the work of trying to 3D model an object with a hole. What you can do is if you drag out this window here, and you have your mesh selected, you can see this little tab right here is Object Modifiers. And if you click on this, this is different modifiers that you can use for your object to help your modeling in a new way. So for example, maybe you want to add a mirror modifier here, and it's going to mirror my object on whatever axis I select. With whatever settings I select. We're just going to disable merging there, and if we go into edit mode and we grab it on the x-axis and pull it one way, you can see it will do the same on the other side, and it will just mirror the object over the x-axis here. Maybe I want to add a boolean is like a hole. So if I want to add another object here and scale it down and scale it on my x-axis and put it through the center of this one, I want this object to have a hole that's shaped like this object in it. What I'm going to do is on this one, I'm going to set my boolean modifier to say the difference of this selected object, and I'm going to click on this one, and then I'm just going to click apply and then delete this one, and you can see I just put a hole in there. All this stuff doesn't really matter, you don't need to know this stuff, but this is just to say that on your objects you can use object modifiers to help your editing as well. Right down here you can see you have this little thing that's called your proportional editing tool, and if you enable this, this is going to change your selections based on whichever one of these proportional editing fall-offs you have enabled. So to make that simpler, let's just go into edit mode here by pressing tab, and we're going to select this corner vertice. And if I press G to grab the vertice and move it, you can see it's just moving this corner. But if I turn on my proportional editing by clicking enable, and then I'm going to set it to smooth, it's going to smoothly grab all the other corners around it that I have selected. So now if I press G, you see I have this circle here. If it's very small, it's not going to control anything else. But if I make it bigger, it's going to also slowly grab onto the other ones and move it with it. And this is called your proportional editing tool because it's proportionally grabbing all the other things as you want them. And so I can make object shaped more like this now if I want to give it a more organic feel, I suppose. Similarly, when you're editing, you also don't have to necessarily say you want it to grab them in a smooth way. Maybe you want them to grab them in a constant way. So if I press G now, it's going to take all the ones that are with it and not smoothly or gradually grab them with it, but it's going to constantly and consistently grab it in the position. Basically, you can see these ones are staying exactly with it. In the same way, you could go with random, and you could take your one object and it will randomly select how strong it pulls them away from it, and you can get some pretty oddball shapes going on. and that's your proportional editing tool. What if you want to color your object? So I'm going to put my cursor to the center here just by pressing Shift-S cursor to center and spawn in a new mesh object. And I want my person here, or whatever it is, just to have a texture or a color. Well, on the same panel over here, we're going to go to this little material page, and we're just going to click the first material that is available there. Or, of course, you can create a new material. I'm going to name this material blue, and just click diffuse and set it to the blue color here. And what if I want this one object to have multiple colors on it? Well, I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to select this face over here because this is the new face that I want. I'm going to hit plus a new color on this, and I'm going to create a new color. I'm going to set this one to red, and then we're going to set this to a red color. Now all we need to do is assign our selected face by first selecting the face and then clicking assign, and you can see it's going to change that face to our set color. And so now you can color objects using this UI menu for materials over here as well. If you go into File up in the corner here, you have a bunch of different options. Remember saving. You can also do Open Recent, and it will show you all your recent projects here as well. You could start a new project, so if I just want to start over fresh, I'm going to click New, I'm going to click Reload Startup File, and it's going to start me from fresh exactly how I would have started off as if I started a new one. But if I launch into Blender and I want to open my old project, I can just click Open Recent, and that file we saved as Blender, and it will bring me back to here. However, it doesn't have the colors I saved because I didn't save the file. So make sure that you're constantly saving. We have Blender preferences. So if you go into user preferences here, you have a bunch of different settings that you can enable or disable and play around with. A lot of these you probably won't need to use, but it's complex, different things that you can change in Blender and how it works. For example, I have themes here. Maybe I want to change in my 3D view. My grid color right now is currently set to gray. Maybe you want to change it to a white color. You can change your different colors, stuff like that. Background color right here, we can probably change this. You can see over here it changes these different colors, all this stuff. Yeah, there's lots of different stuff. Background, you can see it's changing, all sorts of different fun stuff you can play around with, but this is all just for fun. And there's absolutely no need to use this at all. But maybe you can find something that you enjoy if you want to, because why not? The last thing that you're going to want to probably know is when you're spawning an object, sometimes it comes with settings that apply to the object when you're first spawning it, but you can't change after. So for example, if I want to spawn in an icosphere, it's going to be this circle shape, and you can see this little icon right here, or this menu panel comes up that says Add Icosphere, and you can see it has subdivisions. So it's set to 2 right now. We could set it down to 1, and it's basically the quality of this icosphere. If I put this up to maybe 5 or 4 or 3 or 2, and then I hit tab, and then I go back into object mode, you can see that menu is gone. I can no longer edit the amount of faces on this icosphere because after it's spawned in, those settings can't be played around with anymore. So sometimes just be aware of those settings because you may not be able to edit them later on. So now, starting fresh on a new Blender window here, we're just going to get started on actually modeling our first 3D character. So the first thing they're going to want to do is block out the basic shape of what my character wants to look like. And for this course, we're not going to go super into advanced modeling of our character. We're going to keep it pretty simple and blocky, low poly art style, but we may be able to advance with some practice. But first, I'm just going to take this cube here, I'm going to bring it up to the top, and then I'm going to duplicate it, I'm going to drag it down, I'm going to scale it on the x-axis down a little bit and scale it up on the z-axis a little bit, and maybe even out on the y-axis, and maybe a little bit thicker than I like. So let's try scaling him down a little bit more, and then I'm going to drag the whole thing up because I think he's a little bit short. I'm going to take his chest and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it and right click to put it back in the center, and then just drag it downwards for a leg shape. And then I'm going to scale it on the y-axis and drag it down, and that leg is a little bit thick, so we'll scale it down on the y-axis a little bit more. And then we will scale the whole thing down and maybe scale it up on the z-axis, and that's probably a pretty good leg shape. So I'm going to duplicate it and then right click, so we have two legs just sitting on top of each other here, and then I'm going to press G to move it, and then I'm going to press Y just to move it on the y-axis, and then on the keyboard here I'm going to type in maybe 0.3, and that's a little bit less than I like, so G Y 0.6 maybe. Yeah, I think that's a good place. I'm going to take the other one, right click on it, and then GY negative 0.6, so that we have our two legs and they're nicely centered there. And I like those. I think they're looking pretty good. So we're going to take them, we're going to press Shift D, and we're going to move them upwards just by right clicking, so they pop back into the center, and move them to about here. Then I'm going to take just this leg, and it will now be an arm, and I will move it maybe another 0.6 in the further direction, and I will press G, and then press Y, and then maybe another negative 0.6. And same with this one, I'll right click here, and then press G, and then press Y, and then just type in 0.6, and I think that's probably pretty good. Maybe I need them a little bit further, but I'll shift select the other arm and move it up to about here. Yeah, so I think the arms are a little bit close. Well, first we'll attach the legs by moving them upwards, selecting them both and making sure they're attached to our body. And I'm going to take this arm here and hit GY 0.3, and that's probably a little bit better. Same with this one, GY negative 0.3. And these two arms I think are looking a little bit big, so we will just press S to scale them down, and then S and Z to make them a little bit taller, and that's probably a little bit better. Actually, I'm going to Command Z, Command Z, Command Z, undo those. I'm just going to take this one arm and then press S 0.8 so that it just gets smaller on the spot that it's in, and then right click the other one, S 0.8, and then I'll take them both and scale them up on the Z axis. So that's looking pretty good to me. We might want this to not look so blocky now. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take our chest and we'll press Tab, and so we're going to edit this so it's not just a cube anymore but looks a little bit more chest-like. So the first thing I'm going to do is press Control R so that we bring up this cut line, and I'm going to click right in the center when I get this pink line, and I'm just going to move it up to maybe around where his chest is a little bit, and then just press S to scale it up a little bit so that it looks like he has a little bit more of a chest here. And that looks a lot better already. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take his neck right here, and I'm going to press S and then scale it down quite a ways, and maybe about there, and then I'm going to press S and then Y so that we scale it down so that it's like a cube shape like that, so it's a bit more of a square. Now it might look a little bit funny at first, but now if I drag this all the way down to here, and then take all of these just by right-clicking here and then pressing Shift and selecting the rest of them and moving them up to where the neck will be, that should be a bit better of a body shape for me, I think. And I think right down here, this might need to be a little bit smaller, so I'm just going to press Tab on his torso and scale that down a little bit, just like that. So now we have a bit more of a chest shape. And his head looks a little bit big as well, so I'm just going to scale that down and drag that down. And so there, now we have a rough cutout of what a body should look like. And the first thing that I'm going to want to do actually is just texture him to make it a little bit more distinct. So I'm going to right click on his arm here, and we're going to pull out this color. I'm going to set it to material 0. I'm going to call this skin. And then let's just give this a nice skin color, maybe something like that. I'm going to right click this one, set it to skin as well. And his head too, why not? His chest, I'm going to give a new color. Let's just call this a shirt. This will be his shirt color, and maybe let's give him a nice green shirt, something like that. And his legs as well, we'll give him a new color. We'll call this pants, and we'll make this a nice blue color, something like that. And this one we'll set to the pants color as well. And the skin looks a little bit too white, so I'm just going to change this again to something a little bit more darker skin color. Something like that maybe. I'm not quite sure about that, but somewhere in there. And then the last thing that we're going to do is just make sure we select one of our body parts, and then while holding shift, we're going to select all these other body parts as well, so that we select all of the different parts of our body, and then we're just going to press Control and J, which will group all of them together. So now that our person is one person, and then now you can see if I press Tab, it will edit everything all at once rather than just a single object. And then I'm just going to press Command S and then click here so that I make sure my person is now saved. And so this is everything for episode 1, basics and intro to Blender and 3D modeling. Hopefully you'll be able to make your own 3D character after this, and in the next episode we will start rigging our character and then weight painting him later on, and then eventually animating him and exporting him to our Unity project. But hopefully you'll be able to get a basic character 3D modeled out of this tutorial video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.